Welcome to episode 39 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. This week we're going to be looking at the Latin text of Book 3, starting around location 94. We're going to start the episode with a catch-up from last week, where we had a couple of comments remaining that were not discussed. And then Martin is going to read the text for us today. This is going to be an episode where we're dealing with some complicated material for most of us for the first time. So this will be a good example of how hopefully it will be helpful to people to listen to other ordinary people like themselves wrestle with ideas in Lucretius that are not exactly familiar to us. And it will require that we go back and look at perhaps some Plato and other sources that will help us to understand what it was that Epicurus was facing and the kind of arguments that he had to deal with. Let's dive into that today, and we'll continue the same topic for the next several weeks. So now let's join the discussion already in progress. Charles, do you have particular things you'd like to talk about from last week?
Not something to add, but there was a section that kind of stuck out for me, at least in the Daniel Browne translation from last week's text.
Do you have it in front of you, or let's go ahead and talk about it?
I do have it in front of me, yeah. The second paragraph from 38, or last week, the last sentence. But the wide tracts of hell are nowhere seen, nor does the interposing earth prevent our sight, but we discover what beneath our feet is doing in the space below. In these pursuits a certain divine pleasure spreads round me, and I stand amazed, that by thy strength of mind all nature every way lies naked to our view. And I know in that paragraph he was talking about how the concept of atoms and void do away with divine will and intervention and providence. And then he talked very, very briefly about the nature of the gods. But those last 2 sentences kind of stuck out as, well, I don't know, it felt odd compared to everything else he had said.
We did not talk about it that much last week. In what way did it strike you as odd? Are you talking about the divine pleasure that he feels in observing these things? Now, I would jump to the conclusion there that he's talking about maybe a close analogy to where Epicurus talks about how philosophy itself is a pleasure. Mm-hmm. That knowledge can be, certainly knowledge is pleasurable at times. In many instances, knowing something that you're curious about brings a great pleasure to know about it.
Generally that's how I'd go about it, because how it ends with, and I stand amazed that by thy strength of mind all nature every way lies naked to our view, that through, the physics and epistemology and canon, or generally speaking the philosophy, the nature of things is much more concrete and grounded in reality than leaving everything up to myth and legend.
Yeah, now I don't know if this is exactly what you're touching on either. You may not even have been able to listen to last week's episode, it sounds like, but to me this touches on the issue of your attitude towards Epicurus and attitude towards Epicurean philosophy, and sort of your personal sense of feeling gratitude, feeling appreciation, feeling liberation almost, if you want to take it to that level, that this is an accomplishment that is so valuable to you in freeing you or in removing concerns and fears that you have about death or about gods. It is such a significant thing to you. I think that's the direction he's going there, that some people might stumble over the word divine pleasure, but the issue is that these are immortal things that we're talking about and discussing infinity and the issues that are most deep in the background of the universe, and that it's not a mortal pleasure, but an immortal pleasure, I think, is another phrasing that they use in another location.
Yeah, and I could look at another translation, or I didn't go back to look at the Latin text,
But is there anything else you're thinking about it that we should discuss? Is it the issue of whether wisdom equates to pleasure? Because that's kind of an interesting tangent we could possibly go on, is that wisdom alone, wisdom for itself, is just another virtue and not something that Epicurus would say is worthwhile in itself unless it brings pleasure. And in these cases, he's talking about wisdom that does bring pleasure. Well, maybe we should go ahead then to what we have for today's episode, unless you have something further.
No.
Well, we got to have somebody to read today. Well, whenever you're ready, Martin.
First then, I say, the mind of man, which you commonly call the soul, in which is placed the conduct and government of life, is part of man no less than the hand. The foot, the eyes, are parts of the whole animal. So many of the philosophic herd have fancied that the sense of the mind is not fixed to any particular part, but it is a sort of vital habit of the whole body, which the Greeks call harmony. And thence flows all our sense, and the mind has no particular place for its abode. As when we say health belongs to the body, yet it is no part of the body that is in health, so no particular part that tell us is a residence of the mind. But in this they seem to be egregiously wrong, for often when some visible part of the body suffers pain, we feel pleasure in some other part to us unseen. And the contrary often happens in its turn, that a man disturbed in mind is perfectly well all over his body, in the same manner as when a man has a gout in his foot, his head at the same time is free from pain. Besides, when our limbs are given up to soft sleep, and the varied body lies stretched at length without sense, there is something within that in the very time is variously affected, and receives into itself all the impressions of joy and empty cares that torment the heart. But to convince you that the soul is a part like other limbs, and not as a harmony, takes up the whole body. Observe first that many members of the body may be cut off, yet often life remains in the rest. And again, the same life when a few certain particles of vital heat fly off, and our last breath is blown through the mouth, immediately leaves possession of our veins and bones. And this will give you to understand that all the particles of matter are not of equal consequence to the body, nor do they equally secure our lives. But the particles of our breath and the warm vapor are of principal concern to preserve life to us in all our limbs. This warmth, this vapor, therefore resides in the body, and leaves our limbs as death makes approaches towards us. But since the nature of the mind and soul is discovered to be a part of the man, give these fiddlers their favorite word, harmony, again, take from the music of the harp, or whensoever they borrow the name, and applied it to the soul, which then, forsooth, had no proper name of its own. However it be, let them take it again, and do you attend what follows. I say then that the mind and soul are united together, and so joined make up one single nature. But what we call the mind is, as it were, the head, and conducts and governs the whole body, and keeps its fixed residence in the middle region of the heart. Here our passions live. Our dread and fear beats here. Here our joys make everything serene. Here, therefore, must be the seat of the mind. The other part, the soul, spreads through the whole body, obeys this mind, and is moved by the nod and impulse of it.
Thank you, Martin. I'd like to say before we get too far into discussing the details today that I think we're about to go through a section that has some analogies with where we've been in the past in this sense, that when we start talking about the atoms in detail, there are reasons we're discussing it, and we need to keep those reasons in mind for what they say about the nature of the universe and the nature of whether there's any supernatural control and so forth. And we're not necessarily looking for Lucretius for the latest information on how things really are at the quantum level. We're trying to get a lesson from the general conclusions that he reached, which are probably still generally valid. And so now here we're going to be talking about the mind and the soul, and we're discussing his theories of how the mind and the soul operate within the body. And we're probably going to run into the same kind of problems we did regarding the atoms and the void. We're going to find that the way he analyzes it is not the same as we do today, but the conclusions he reaches are probably the most important thing. And I think where he's going with what we're discussing today, and that's what we'll discuss as we go through the details, is just that the mind or the soul, and we're going to have to discuss what those words mean to him and to us and so forth, but he's ultimately making the point that the consciousness, the mind, the soul, is not supernatural, but is part of the body, and that it is born with the body, it grows with the body, and it dies with the body, and it's not supernatural and it's not not going to hell. And he's going to have an elaborate theory of how he reaches that conclusion that leads us through examples of how the mind is essentially a component of the physical body. And I think that's the ultimate significance of all that we're talking about, even though we certainly have different ways of expressing these issues today. And so it's going to be kind of a challenge as we go through this. I think already it's unclear to me how the best way to approach this. I think the Latin would be animus, anima, and it would be one word. And then there's Greek words that are involved, including psyche probably, or Greek-derived terms. And I don't think that we are going to profit the most by spending all of our time worrying about those details. We need to bring them out to the extent we can, but if somebody wants to really study the details of ancient Greek psychological theory, they're probably going to need to go to some other sources to do that. So with that sort of as a general statement, and Elaine is with us today, but is having to mute herself right now, but hopefully she'll be joining us as the episode goes on. And to some extent, in the past, we've had sort of a physics expertise to try to reconcile with what Epicurus was saying. And now we have sort of a medical or psychological issue that we're going to be discussing for a while. And Elaine is particularly well suited to help us through all that. So why don't we just go back to the beginning of this? And even in the first sentence, he's talking about the mind of man, which we commonly call the soul. Well, of course, soul has so many religious connotations to it. We need to immediately separate out whether Lucretius is talking about something supernatural or not, which of course I don't think he's not. So who wants to jump in and how we talk about the soul and the mind? And one more thing I'll say is obviously he spends time talking about the Greek theory of harmony. He's really not saying in these passages we're talking about today that some people argue that the soul is supernatural. He's really talking about the soul, the question about whether the soul is a single thing, a harmony that flows through all the parts of our body, or whether our consciousness is somehow confined to particular regions of the body, which, of course, is another hurdle because we consider the consciousness to be seated in the brain. And for interesting reasons, the Epicureans apparently considered this force to be centered in the region of the heart, which is also very interesting to talk about. But we're going to have to figure out where to begin to jump into it all. So who wants to make a suggestion as to how we talk about mind versus soul? Don't everybody talk at once. What do you think, Charles?
It's kind of a messy debate, and I'm actually kind of looking ahead through the rest of the paragraph. But oh man.
Well, if we wanted to distill this one down today into a single issue, he is saying that the soul does not exist as a harmony, but that it is seated in a particular area of the body. Now, to make sense out of that statement, you've got to decide what is the mind, what is the soul, and then what in the world are the Greeks talking about with this harmony?
Yeah, because, all signs point to Pythagoras there.
Martin, you have any expertise on harmony and the Greek view of harmony?
No.
Well, neither do I, and I'm not sure whether Elaine does or not, but she's not going to be able to jump in for a few minutes yet, so we'll just do the best we can in the meantime. I think you're right, Charles, that whether it's Pythagoras, whether it's, I don't know who is the person to whom you attribute the music of the spheres and the different concepts that seem to roll around the idea that all of the universe is a symphony and just operates with such a divinely inspired motion that it's all just a harmonic, amazing structure. I think there's at least an aspect of that is involved when you start talking about harmony from the Greek point of view. And I think the implication, therefore, is that these other Greeks who are thinking about the mind and the soul as being a divine spark or as something divine, they're refusing, because they consider it to be divine, they're refusing to put it in a particular place within the body. They're considering it to be outside the body, above the body, separate from the body. And Epicurus is going to be arguing, Lucretius is arguing that the soul or the mind or whatever you want to call this consciousness is a part of the body, no less than the foot or the head or any other part of it.
This is Elaine. I don't know if you can hear
Yes.
noise in the background. Can you hear me?
No,
okay?
no, you're
And there's
coming.
not too
You're
much
coming
in the
through
background
great.
noise.
Great.
So I want to say that the first thing that jumps in my mind, just speaking physiologically, the way he describes it, it sounds like you could almost say he's describing the mind the way we would describe the brain and the soul, like the nervous system.
Yes, yes. The electrical impulses or whatever that go through you from your finger to your brain. It sounds like
Because he says spread through the whole body, so that make you think of the nerves, and then the mind as the brain. So I don't know if that's what he was talking about, but I like how he says that is joined together, and so joined make up one single nature. So it really does sound like the nervous system to me.
Mm-hmm. What about this harmony issue, Elaine? Do you have any?
That I don't know about it. It sounds like he's referencing some philosophy that I'm not familiar with.
Well, I doubt we can educate ourselves on Wikipedia or anywhere else today quickly enough to be.
I'm only getting a single sentence summary from Cicero's
Tusculan Disputations is something similar to that. You see something there about harmony?
Yeah, the Pythagorean theory that the soul is a harmony of the four elements composing the body and therefore mortal, or nothing at all in the words of Cicero, was ascribed to Aristoxenus and Dicaearchus. The theory is comparable to one offered by Simmias in Plato's Phaedo. And this Aristoxenus guy was a pupil of Aristotle in the Peripatetic school, who was greatly inspired by Pythagoras.
Well, yeah, we could probably just tell a lot by what he's arguing here. And this is an interesting section here for some discussions we've had in the past, especially I remember some discussions with Elaine about feeling pleasure in one part of your body and pain in another. At the end of this first paragraph here, he's specifically talking about how you can feel pleasure. A man disturbed in mind is perfectly well all over his body in the same manner as when a man has gout in his foot, his head at the same time is free from pain. So there's a lot of things in this material today.
Yeah, I remember that thread. I pulled it up. It was back in January. Our consensus was that we could feel it both at the same time, but that there was no third state or third state that came about through the simultaneous feelings of the two. And I think we made another thread about it, because I remember like the pebble in your shoe as you climb a mountain or whatever. I seem to remember that coming up. And the summit and the pleasure viewed from it when you accomplish that despite, your body being sore.
And then, of course, in trying to gather what his main point is here, I see there's this passage about where he says he's going to try to convince us that the soul is a part like other limbs and not as a harmony. And, of course, then it's not clear. It says takes up the whole body. This would be a good opportunity to look at some of the other translations.
Okay, I'm finding...
I viewed that.
Go ahead, Elaine.
So I found a discussion of Socrates' arguments on the soul, and there's the argument from Simmias, whom I'm not familiar with, the harmony and the lyre. And the argument would be the lyre and its strings are matter, material, earthly composite, and akin to mortality. The harmony is invisible, incorporeal, fair, divine, and abides in the lyre. When the lyre is broken, the harmony is perished even before the lyre. Conclusion, the soul, like the harmony, perishes when the body, like the lyre, ceases to function. And then the response from Socrates, harmony is not pre-existent to the lyre. Either Simmias' argument or the pre-existence of the soul is invalid. The pre-existence of the soul has been proven already by Socrates. In conclusion, the Simmias lyre harmony analogy must be invalid.
It sounds like Simmias is pretty close to Epicurus in his view there.
Yeah. So, and I'm not familiar with him. Any of y'all?
I do not.
There's a section of him in Diogenes Laertius. I find this is Plato's Socrates, but I find the fourth opposition Plato brings to it pretty interesting. It says here, the soul is the ruling principle of the body, but attunement is governed by the material of the musical instrument. By analogy, that would make the body the ruler of the soul.
It's hard to tell where that goes, because Plato would not be saying that he's using that as a reason for why the body is not the ruler of the soul, right, Charles? Because Plato would not consider the body to be the ruler of the soul, as I would understand it.
That's correct.
So that must be his argument for why a particular theory is not correct.
It's directly addressing point 4 in Simmia's attunement analogy, that the soul is like a tune or harmony of the parts of the body. If the body is destroyed, the tune cannot survive. And that is what Plato's Socrates is talking about by saying that the body would have priority, or a sense of priority over the soul.
And why they cannot accept that argument. Because I don't remember if it's in this section or not, but we're clearly about to get to it here in Epicurus, because Epicurus is going to talk about when the body gets sick, the mind gets sick as well. And you see examples of that. I think that's probably not today, but it'll be soon. Of course, I don't know that Epicurus would say that the body rules the soul, but they certainly are together, born together, grow together, die together. I think it's clearly at least part of what he's going to be saying. He clearly does not like the analogy of a harmony as if it were brought down to musicians from Helicon, or whether they've taken it somewhere else and transferred it to that thing which was in need of a name. He does not like the idea that the consciousness is a harmony.
I took a very simplified approach to that. Just that by joining the soul and mind with the body, as opposed to what Daniel Browne translates as, but as a sort of vital habit of the whole body, which the Greeks call harmony. I was thinking more of the obsolete but still more modern term, or concept, I should say, of élan vital, or basically the sort of arguments of the vitalist philosophies from the late 19th century and early 20th century, where I took vital habit into what they described as the vital force, a very abstract principle of living or life that was inherent to every human being. Of course, modern science and specifically genetics has sort of proven that wrong, but that's sort of the view I took about it for simplification, that really sort of grounded it for me in a way that made perfect sense. I don't know if that's going to apply for anybody else, but
Elaine?
I think that makes sense, Charles.
Rather than an obscure.
But so what I'm also thinking of is harmony. It sounds to me, and I wish I had looked at this longer ahead of time to think about that. But it sounds like we're kind of arguing whether consciousness is emergent.
Yes.
Right. And harmony would be emergent. It sounds like to me from this that it's a property that doesn't exist by itself, free from the body, but it's emergent from the actions of the nervous system, the material bodies. And he's arguing that it's got its own particles. It sounds to me the Epicurus is arguing a non-emergent theory of hypothesis about consciousness. Am I getting? Do you think?
I don't know whether that is correct or not. I'm not prepared to say you're wrong, but I'm not prepared to say you're right either, because so much of what we're talking about is an issue of emergence, that everything is grounded in the particles, but the observations that we see in our world emerge from those particles. I'm thinking that the harmony is an implication that there's some separateness between, and see, I don't consider the emergence to be separate from the things that it emerges from. I consider that to be sort of a continuum, and I'm thinking that these other Greeks he's criticizing are saying that the soul actually, in Socrates or Plato's case, they said it was pre-existent, or that this harmony they're talking about could be some kind of a supernatural thing that inhabits the body. At least that's what I'm trying to keep in mind as potentially what the distinction is. But because when you talk about emergence, Elaine, that's probably what we ought to return to and talk about. I mean, I think you have emergent properties they're not the same thing as the particles, but they stem from and are inseparable from the particles, right?
So this is a kind of hard concept to understand. There's two ways they could be talking about harmony. It's, this vital habit could be like a sort of a pre-existing template almost, or a characteristic of all the particles, that it is a property of its own, not that it only appears once the particles are put together. Some people might say DNA could be a vital habit, right? And that it's throughout the body, and without that template, we wouldn't have this. But of course, they didn't know about that in ancient Greece.
But the DNA is part of the body, and it's absolutely the body, right?
Right. So the question is whether the vital habit predates the body, that it's already something that's sort of a principle that's in existence, or a law, maybe we don't like we talk about laws of physics, not a rule, but a consistent way of a pattern of interactions of material objects, or does it only show up secondarily? And this is, I mean, there's actually still debate on that.
Well, Elaine, which of that, can you clarify when you talk about what you just said, which of those theories are you associating with Epicurus, and which are you associating with Plato and Socrates?
So to me, I thought, which is not, it's not really clearly said here, but I know that I have where he says the soul is a part like the other limbs and not as a harmony takes up the whole body. He is saying that it's a specific kind of substance, and that it is not emergent. Just I don't know if he's clearly saying that it doesn't come about as a result of the other particles, but it takes up the whole body, that is particles. I mean, didn't he see the soul as actually being a particular kind of particle?
He sees the soul as composed of, there's the discussion of a particular type of particle that is associated with the soul as being extremely light and extremely
fine.
Fine.
Yes. And so it would not have been just in that way, what he's calling soul or consciousness or whatever he means by that. He's not saying that it's just a like the appearance of something that we would call a car is emergent from putting together the parts. And you're not going to say that carburetor is a car, right? But we put together all the parts. We have a car and it drives. That is how most people see consciousness now, like neuroscience researchers, that you have to have the parts together and then the consciousness is emergent from that. He's not saying that. He's saying there's something spread through the whole body, which is the consciousness, that it is a part, not, like the other limbs, not something that comes from them. And that's not the mainstream thought today in neuroscience. It would be contrary to it. So I think this is one of those cases where it depends on how you look at it. It's not exactly right. But if you think about it like as the nervous system, then you can kind of make a case that it's not a certain kind of particle, but it is a certain organ in the body. You can kind of rescue it that way, but not completely.
We've got a lot more detail about all this that we're going to be coming to over the next couple of episodes and passages here. So I'm not sure what the right answer is at this moment. And I do think it's going to be important for us to be thinking about what it means to be an emergent property and so forth. I don't really have any final position on that. Martin, do you have anything to correct us at this point?
No, I'm a bit at a loss here. I still couldn't separate things out. So I'm just listening and try to put something meaningful into it.
Well, a lot of what we accomplish, hopefully, is to help people think through things with us as we come into contact with these ideas for the first time in many cases. So I'm still, Martin, I know your physics and background. Is there anything going through your mind at all that would be of relevance for us to talk about right now? Because in terms of just what your general reaction is to what direction he's even going.
No, that is the thing. I still couldn't sort it out. So I couldn't say anything meaningful to this at the moment.
Okay, maybe also before next week I can do some more reading and find out something about what the specific harmony theory was. And I bet as we go forward too, we're going to see more of his arguments, and it's going to give us some more clarity on exactly what he's distinguishing here. Charles?
Yeah, I wanted to reinforce what Elaine was saying, actually, because there is a known link between the sort of vitalism, like the vital force and the elan vital, with like emergent behavior and properties and processes. So there's definitely a link there in terms of lines of thinking, but because vitalism, like I mentioned earlier, with sort of its obsolete pseudoscientific nature, there are links to it with like emergentism, but usually it becomes like a garbled mess of,
Yeah.
how do I put it?
A garbled mess of ambiguity. I know in my own, what's going on in my mind right this second is I don't know what vitalism means. I don't know what harmony is intended to address. It's not even 100% clear to me half the time what is meant by talking about emergent properties and so forth. So, and I don't even know, I'm presuming that the argument he's attempting to go against is some kind of a supernatural argument of religion, that the soul is supernatural and that it preexists the body and that it postdates the death, and therefore, and I'm almost certain that that's the direction he's ultimately aiming at. But because the arguments of Plato and Socrates and these guys are so kind of foreign to us, or foreign to me, I'm not sure that I can at this moment construct anything clear about where he's going, other than or about where he is right now. I think I have a sense about where he intends to go, but as far as where he is right now, especially how he concludes, for example, that here's the quote. He says, but that the head, as it were, and the Lord and in the whole body is the reason, which we call mind or understanding, and it is firmly seated in the middle region of the breast. Now, most of the time when they come up with something, I can pretty much understand why they reached that conclusion. But it's kind of hard for me to understand how they were focusing on the middle of the chest or the heart as the seat of something versus the brain. But they don't do things without having a good reason for it. So there's got to be something about their reasoning or their thought process that is not clear to me to explain that.
So, Cassius, I think it's probably because when we have feelings, it feels like it's
yes.
in that region of the body.
I was going to say I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head because, of course, but that's something that's common in a lot of old and ancient
sensation.
Philosophies in different cultures, that your passions, your feelings, your emotions are all felt in the chest. When you're really sad, you feel it in your heart.
Yeah.
And the allegories of like heartbreak or whatever.
So I think where I would say, just at least from this passage, is that an idea of a predetermined before the body exists, he's rejecting that correctly. But then the other conclusions he comes to about it being a particular consciousness being tied to a particular particle are not correct. And so then I thought about one other thing to consider, that just having a nervous system does not mean that there will be consciousness. Think about that, because we've got people who are in comas who are unconscious, and so just having a nervous system is not enough. It's not sufficient.
Or unconscious in a coma. Or what about just being asleep? Are you conscious when you're asleep?
Well, you sort of are, and I don't know. I find that kind of confusing. I don't want to.
Well, that's what the next paragraph touches on, doesn't it?
More than I know about that. So, but I think in dreams you're conscious, but you're not getting the same sensory input that you do when you're having your waking consciousness. But you can be, is that what we call it brain dead, right? But your nervous system isn't gone completely. It's the actual physical structure is still there. It's just not functioning. So it's much more complicated than what it looks like. I don't think anybody really today thinks that there's some kind of mind particle that's spread through the body. So he went a little too far, as he did.
I think he was addressing contemporary arguments.
Yeah.
And positions that obviously don't exist today.
Yeah, and so I think he's right to argue against those, and then he went a little further than he had evidence for, and that has happened with him before. But he's correct about what he's arguing against. So we're going to find stuff in here that works and stuff that doesn't. But it's a real interesting thought process.
Does anybody, I think there's a lot of things we're going to have to clarify as we go forward. Does anybody doubt the direction he's ultimately, or does anybody suspect that he's going in any direction other than his argument that the mind, the soul, the consciousness is a part of the body, and that it is born with the body and dies with the body? Does that seem like probably the ultimate end point of where he's going?
The upper level, just the broadest view, yes. And so that would be right. It's only when he gets down into the nitty gritty details that he gets a little farther than he should. But the overall, yes.
Well, I asked that question because some of this is so murky that I'm not 100% sure that that's the only conclusion to be drawn from the argument that he's getting into here now. Is there any possibility that he's going in any other direction? Because again, I think it's dangerous to consider Lucretius to be science for the sake of science. There's always a reason why he's talking about something.
Yeah, so, I think that part of what I'm saying is because of other things that I've read about Epicurus' idea about the soul. So it does not all in here. But this part where he says the soul is a part, it's not really exactly right. It's an emergent property, different from a part. And I don't even know if he has that idea, that understanding of what an emergent property can be with regard to this or not. And we'll just have to read more and see whether that comes up. But it really isn't a part.
Well, why don't we begin to come to an end for today? Because we have so much more to factor in that we can just leave it on a cliffhanging note about where he's eventually going to go with all this. Does anybody see anything else that they really would like to comment on today before we start to wrap up?
No, I don't think so.
No, I think we should look further into Simmias's dialogue there. I think Phaedo was being referenced here because the second to last paragraph he likens harmony to the music of the harp, and I mean that could just be coincidental because the harp or the lyre is a common instrument back then, but I do think he was addressing a Platonic or even Pythagorean concept there.
Charles, that's very valuable. I completely agree. Can you put a link in the thread here on this episode 39 so that we can find what you're looking at? And because almost definitely, if there's a specific exchange in Plato with Socrates talking about the lyre and harmony there, almost definitely that's going to be something that Epicurus would have been thinking about. He would have known, his students would have known about, and would have wanted to deal with. So,
yeah.
Phaedo, I put a link in the Skype, but I have to actually look into the Phaedo, which is, that's a large dialogue.
Can you put it?
Well, we have homework for this week.
Right, Charles. Do you mind putting in the thread here on Epicurean Friends so people who are listening to the podcast can find it?
Yeah, I'll put it there too. I'll see if I can link it in on like Gutenberg or something.
Okay. Well, next week we'll definitely get some more input from Martin on his analysis of the harmony of the spheres, the harmony of the soul. Right, Martin?
We might also want to, I didn't mean to interject, but we might also want to learn a bit more about vitalism going forward, because I think we can really link it back to some ancient theories about the soul itself being a unique property of living things. So we might have
well, that's pretty much the topic of this entire book. We'll be covering for weeks and weeks for a while. So yeah, I'll try to dig into that next week and be better prepared myself.
Oh man, Simmias is referred to 110 times in Phaedo.
I don't even remember. I don't have an understanding of what the theme of Phaedo is, or I know Timaeus is certain the universe, but what is Phaedo about? Do you know?
It's about the immortal nature of the soul.
That's probably one we need to be looking at then. I'll have to make a point of trying to read that this week. I know I've not spent significant time with Phaedo in the past. So.
Yeah, it's one of his more well-known one. I think it was one of the last he wrote as well.
Well, I know many of our listeners, and us included, are not able to just spend unlimited amounts of time digging into the details of Plato, but this is going to be one where we need to get some kind of a grounding. Maybe Wikipedia can help us somewhere.
It would take hours to read this and understand it.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're just about hit our hour mark for the day, so let's go ahead and come to a conclusion. Anybody have anything else to add?
I guess I will just add that this is a good example of what readers who are trying to read Lucretius maybe on their own may run into if they don't have an extensive philosophical background, that sometimes it's a good idea to stop, slow down, and find out about some of the other sources that Epicurus was responding to, what was actually going on during his time. And this is not the first time that has happened, and there's no problem with that. So when those things come up, we don't have to freak out just because we don't have a philosophy degree. We can take a minute and go and investigate, and our listeners can do the same thing. So that's one advantage of presenting this as lay people.
Yeah.
A podcast for ordinary people who can read this and not feel intimidated by it. That's fine. We can make use of Wikipedia. No shame.
That's right. That's a great point, Elaine. Okay. Well, anything, Martin?
No, nothing from me.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Let's go ahead and adjourn for the day, and we'll be back next week and take it up again. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.